Ahoy! Commodore Vice here, continuing the series Navigating the Game with 7th Sea 2nd Edition. Today we're going to be covering mostly the system and the rolling aspects of it. This includes the topics of traits, skills, as well as risks, which are what you would be rolling for most often. Now, you would also roll dice in dramatic scenes and action scenes, but we're going to actually cover those in a later video because they're so dense. Now, for resolving actions that can be out of conflict in 7th Sea, like risky situations in which you're not so sure the hero will succeed or not, you typically roll for it. Now, the first part of creating your dice pool for rolling are traits. Now, there are 5 traits in 7th Sea. There's brawn, which is a measure of your character's physical strength and toughness. There's finesse, which is their agility and dexterity. There's resolve, which is their will to keep going as well as kind of their stamina. There's wits, which is a measure of their intelligence as well as how quickly they think. And then there's panache, which is style and charisma. These are all the main 5 traits of the game, which will compose half of the dice pools you roll to see if you succeed at a particular risk or not. Now, the second part of that dice pool is going to be skills. These are more raw base intuition of what your character is, like how intelligent they are or how strong they are, but it's more a measure of their skills in particular areas. There are a total of 16 skills in this game. That goes from aim, your ability to, fire a shot or throw an object accurately. Athletics, how good you are at running, jumping, swimming. Brawl, your ability to fight hand-to-hand. Convince, your ability to sway somebody with a little bit of elegance and tact. Empathy, your ability to sense the emotions of somebody else. Hide, your ability to get out of sight. Intimidate, your ability to brute force, scare somebody into something. Notice, your ability to spot things that others may not. Perform, your ability to tell a story, sing a song, do a dance. Ride, your ability to ride a horse or object, perhaps. Sailing, your aptitude at sea. Scholarship, the amount you know or understand about the world, usually book smarts, essentially. Tempt, how well you can manipulate somebody to do what you want. Theft, your ability to do things like pick locks, steal from somebody, just generally underhanded things. Warfare, your knowledge and aptitude in the battlefield. And weaponry, your skill with a weapon in your hand, like a sword or rapier or something of that nature. Now, these would be the second half of your dice pool. So basically, we'll get into the more detailed aspects of it in the next section, but what would happen is you would determine an action, and you would pick one trait and one skill that accurately represent how you're handling the situation, put them together, and roll that many d10s. Now, we're going to go ahead and get into the next section, which will actually give you a more detailed idea of how these systems work together. Alright, so we've got risks. Now, risks won't be the only situations in which you will roll a dice pool. There will be other situations as well, mainly combat, action scenes, and dramatic scenes. However, those are a little more dense and might require their own video, whereas risks are a bit simpler. They're your more straightforward rolls. A risk is essentially a situation that is presented to a player that has the potential to fail. Usually a little more dramatic than that. I mean, it's not like, do you roll to pick up the coffee mug? It's situations that have a genuine tension. Let's go through an example, shall we? We'll do a risk structure. That way you can understand how your traits and your skills factor into it, and what the general sway of of rolling for a risk actually does. Rolling for a risk has about 8 basic steps. Step 1 is to set the stage. That's where your storyteller or GM will set the scenario. So for our example, let's say that the ship you're on has caught fire. You are at sea, the coast is within sight, but there is also another ship alongside of you. This is the ship that set you on fire. They threw torches and shot cannon into your side. There is battle raging on the top of the deck, and your goal is to kind of get to the steering wheel and just take control of the ship. Now, that's setting the scene, so that the player is obviously aware of the situation that is going on. I mean, you might want to throw in some things like there are ropes hanging from above, stuff like that, to give them a clearer idea of the opportunities that are present. Alright, the second part of rolling for a risk is the player decides what their approach is. Now, this is important for the player, because when you approach something, you can literally approach it with any combination of skill and trait. You could approach the situation in our example with scholarship and panache. But it's not always the most appropriate. It's not just a matter of getting the biggest dice pool. Because in situations like that, where it's scholarship and panache, if your GM decides that the actions you're about to undertake don't match your approach, they require an additional raise, which is a pretty steep price, as you'll understand in just a moment. So you'll decide what your character's approach to the situation is by adding a trait to a skill. Now, once you've done that, you put these dice together and add any additional dice that you may have from backgrounds and advantages, which is something that we'll also get into in a later video. But you can also add dice from style, which is something that your GM might offer you if, when you discuss your approach, you describe it in particularly vivid or stunning detail. So once you have your dice pool collected, you move on to your fourth step, which is to determine the consequences and opportunities the situation has. Now, the consequences are pretty much speak for themselves. Let's go back to our example. Let's say a consequence of the ship catching fire, there is a barrel of gunpowder on deck that, if you're not careful, will explode. Or you're going to receive shrapnel from the side of the ship exploding into splinters of wood. These are consequences to the situation I just described in our example. Now, these consequences you will assign a certain number of raises to. For example, let's say the barrel of gunpowder is on the way to the wheel. If we want to kick it overboard, it'll be an additional raise, right? Or avoiding the shrapnel of wood will be another raise. Now, once we roll our dice pool, we'll know how many raises we have, and we can distribute them as we see fit. If you see where this is going, I think you're beginning to understand risks. Opportunities are quite the opposite. They still require a raise to activate, but they're more beneficial to the player. For example, going back to our example situation, rather than the gunpowder and all that being, which are negative examples, which are consequences, we'll add in the opportunity that one of the invading pirates dropped their gun, which still has shot in it. So there's a loaded pistol within reach on the ground, which may help for a later situation. That will be an opportunity, but it will also cost a raise to activate. So, we've got the consequences of the barrel of gunpowder, the shrapnel of wood, and the opportunity of the loaded gun on deck. Now we move on to the fifth step, which would be to roll and figure out how many raises we have. So we will roll that dice pool, and once we do, we match the dice up into pairs of 10 or more. You want to get as many groups of 10 or more as possible, It can be made of 2, 1, or 3 dice. It does not matter the number of dice as long as it adds up to 10. And then each of those groups of 10 is what is called a raise. Now we figure out the fun part. We use those raises. As we've said, the opportunities and the consequences all cost a raise. So, if we go back to the very beginning, what is the goal we are trying to do? We are trying to reach the wheel from across the deck, right? So that would cost 1 raise. The consequences, the barrel of gunpowder and the shrapnel would be another 2 raises. And then the pistol would be another raise. So that requires 4 raises to get all of the consequences and opportunities present. So, let's say we roll our dice pool and we only get 3. Then we have to decide. You can spend a raise to complete your goal, spend a raise to avoid the barrel, spend a raise to avoid the shrapnel, or spend a raise to pick up the pistol. Now, this is more of a situation for your player to decide. This is where player action comes in. This is where you decide how your character responds. If they're dedicated to get to that wheel, maybe they spend it to get to the wheel, and they spend it to grab the pistol and spend it to avoid the barrel of gunpowder, but forget the shrapnel because they're so dedicated to get to that wheel, to save the ship. It's possible. Now, that is your prerogative as the player. As the GM, you have to decide what happens, for example, when they get hit by that shrapnel. How many wounds do they take? Which, we'll get into wounds in combat in a later video. But, I think you're starting to understand the situation we've got here. This is the basics of how a risk works. Simply laid out. Decide what the situation is. Decide what the player is going to respond with. Figure out opportunities and consequences. Roll. And then figure out what the player spends their raises on avoiding or getting. Simple enough. At least I hope so. Alright, that was the video on rolls, risks, and raises. I hope it helped. We're moving on in the next video to hero points and advantages, so hopefully that'll help understand the dice pools a little bit more, since some of these advantages add bonuses to dice pools. Also, you'll get to understand hero points a little bit more, which kind of play into risks from now and then. So we'll cover hero points next in the video that'll be right up there when I finish it. If you want to check down below in the description, there should be a link to Drive-Thru RPG where you can find the books to 7th Sea. If you want to learn more about the game 7th Sea, how to run it, how to keep playing it, more about the world, like and subscribe. I'll be doing a whole series on it, and then I'll be moving on to other games. And then, I mean, yeah, I hope you stick around. I hope you like the channel. I hope you join the journey.